The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania countryside like a shroud, masking the town of Gettysburg as two great armies stumbled toward each other in the summer of 1863. Neither General Robert Edward Lee nor General George Gordon Meade had planned to fight here, in this quiet crossroads community where 10 roads converged like spokes on a wheel. Yet fate, with its cruel irony, had chosen this peaceful farming village to become the epicenter of the war's most decisive battle. Confederate General Henry Heth's division had marched toward Gettysburg seeking shoes for his barefoot soldiers, expecting to find only local militia. Instead, they encountered the iron-willed cavalry of Brigadier General John Buford, who recognized immediately that whoever controlled the high ground around Gettysburg would control the battle. As the first shots rang out on the morning of July 1, 1863, Buford's dismounted troopers fought desperately to hold the ridges west of town until infantry reinforcements could arrive. The sound of cannon fire echoed across the rolling hills, drawing both armies like moths to flame. For Lee, this unexpected encounter represented an opportunity to strike the Army of the Potomac before it could fully concentrate. His Army of Northern Virginia had been marching through Pennsylvania with confidence born of recent victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. Lee's bold invasion of the North was designed to take the war away from war-torn Virginia, potentially gain European recognition for the Confederacy, and deliver a crushing blow that might force Lincoln to negotiate peace. For the Union, the stakes could not have been higher. The Army of the Potomac, recently reorganized under Meade's command just 3 days prior, was still smarting from the devastating defeat at Chancellorsville in May. Public morale in the North had plummeted, and calls for peace negotiations grew louder with each Confederate victory. President Abraham Lincoln knew that another major defeat, especially on Northern soil, could cripple the Union war effort beyond recovery. According to detailed accounts preserved in the National Archives and documented in numerous Civil War historical records, the initial engagement was characterized by a series of seemingly random encounters that would shape the course of American history. As afternoon approached, the battle intensified. Union General John Frederick Reynolds, commanding the 1st Corps, rushed his men forward to support Buford's beleaguered cavalry. The thunder of artillery mixed with the crack of muskets as Confederate forces under General Ambrose Powell Hill pressed their attack. In the swirling confusion of battle, Reynolds fell to a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet, becoming one of the first high-ranking casualties of what would become a 3-day bloodbath. The Iron Brigade, Reynolds's elite unit, from the western states, fought with savage determination to hold their ground. These men, wearing their distinctive black hats, had earned their nickname through hard fighting in previous campaigns. But they were vastly outnumbered, and as more Confederate divisions arrived on the field, the Union line began to buckle under tremendous pressure. By late afternoon, Confederate forces had pushed the Union troops through the streets of Gettysburg itself. Civilians huddled in cellars as soldiers fought house-to-house combat in their yards and gardens. The retreating Union forces seemed to be facing another catastrophic defeat, their morale shattered and their formations in disarray. Confederate victory appeared certain as Southern soldiers captured hundreds of Union prisoners and seized the town. Yet as the sun began to set on that first day of battle, Union forces consolidated on the high ground south of Gettysburg. Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the prominent ridge running south toward 2 distinctive peaks called the Round Tops would prove to be the salvation of the Union cause. The topography itself seemed to favor defense, offering commanding views of the surrounding countryside and steep slopes that would challenge any attacking force. Dawn on July 2nd revealed the full scope of the confrontation that was unfolding. The Union Army of the Potomac had formed a defensive line resembling a fishhook, with Cemetery Hill at the bend and extending south along Cemetery Ridge toward the Round Tops. This position, though hastily occupied, provided General Meade with the invaluable advantage of interior lines, allowing him to shift troops quickly to any threatened point along his arc-shaped formation. General Lee, observing the Union position from Seminary Ridge to the west, faced a critical decision that would determine the fate of his Pennsylvania campaign. His trusted subordinate, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, urged caution, suggesting they should maneuver around the Union left flank and force Meade to attack them in a defensive position of their own choosing. The enemy is in a strong position. Longstreet argued, and if we attack frontally, we will surely suffer heavy casualties. But Lee, emboldened by his recent victories and confident in the fighting spirit of his army, decided upon a direct assault. He believed his veterans could break through any Union defense if properly coordinated. The plan called for Longstreet's 1st Corps to attack the Union left, while Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell's 2nd Corps would demonstrate against the Union right on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. If executed simultaneously, Lee reasoned, Meade would be unable to reinforce any single threatened point. The afternoon attack began with an artillery bombardment designed to soften the Union lines, but the dense woods and rocky terrain of Little Round Top provided natural protection for the defending forces. As Longstreet's divisions advanced across the open ground between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge, they encountered fierce resistance from Union troops, who had spent the morning improving their positions behind stone walls and earthworks. The fighting for Little Round Top became especially savage, as Confederate forces under General John Bell Hood attempted to seize this commanding height. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Regiment found itself at the extreme left of the Union line, defending against repeated Confederate assaults up the rocky slopes. Chamberlain, a former college professor turned warrior, understood that if his position fell, the entire Union left flank would collapse. Historical documentation from the Maine State Archives and the official records of the War of the Rebellion provides extensive testimony about the desperate fighting on Little Round Top, including Chamberlain's own detailed post-battle reports. As ammunition ran low and his men faced yet another Confederate charge, Chamberlain made one of the war's most daring tactical decisions. With bayonets fixed, he ordered his exhausted regiment to conduct a downhill charge against the surprised Confederates. This unexpected maneuver broke the Confederate assault and secured Little Round Top for the Union, preserving the integrity of Meade's defensive line. Meanwhile, in the wheat field and peach orchard, Union General Daniel Edgar Sickles had advanced his 3rd Corps forward from the main line, creating a vulnerable salient that the Confederates quickly exploited. The fighting in these areas became a chaotic melee, as units from both sides fed reinforcements into the battle piecemeal. The wheat field changed hands multiple times during the afternoon, earning its grim nickname as the Bloody Wheat Field, as casualties mounted on both sides. Despite intense pressure along the entire Union left, Meade's defensive position held firm. The fishhook formation allowed him to rapidly transfer reserves from quiet sectors to threatened points, while Lee's forces, spread across a much longer line, found it difficult to coordinate their attacks effectively. As darkness fell on July 2nd, the Confederate offensive had gained ground but failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that Lee had sought. The cost of the day's fighting was enormous for both armies. Confederate casualties exceeded 8,000 men, while Union losses were nearly as severe. Among the Confederate wounded was General Hood, whose injury would rob Lee of one of his most aggressive division commanders for the crucial 3rd day of battle. The failure to take the Union flanks on July 2nd meant that Lee would face an even more difficult tactical situation as the battle entered its climactic phase. The 3rd day of July 1863 dawned with an ominous quiet that belied the storm to come. General Lee, despite the tactical setbacks of the previous day, remained determined to achieve victory on Northern soil. His invasion of Pennsylvania had been predicated on delivering a crushing blow to Union morale, and he could not afford to retreat without a decisive result. The Confederate commander faced the harsh reality that his army was deep in enemy territory, far from its supply bases, and could not sustain a prolonged campaign. In the pre-dawn darkness, Confederate forces under General Edward Johnson renewed their assault on Culp's Hill, hoping to seize this vital position on the Union right. The attack had been planned for the previous evening, but delays in coordination had pushed it into the early morning hours. Union defenders, having spent the night strengthening their breastworks and bringing up additional artillery, repulsed the Confederate assault with devastating effectiveness. The failure at Culp's Hill left Lee with limited options. His earlier plan to coordinate attacks on both Union flanks had collapsed, and now he contemplated the most audacious gamble of his military career: a massive frontal assault against the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. This sector, held by General Winfield Scott Hancock's Second Corps, appeared to offer the best chance for a breakthrough that could split the Union Army in two. General Longstreet, ever the pragmatist, voiced strong objections to what he saw as a suicidal attack across open ground against prepared positions. "General," he pleaded with Lee, "I have been a soldier all my life, and I should know as well as anyone what soldiers can do. It is my opinion that no 15,000 men ever arranged for battle can take that position." But Lee's mind made his confidence in his veteran infantry unshaken by doubts. The famous Confederate artillery barrage that preceded the assault began at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, with more than 150 guns opening fire simultaneously. The thunderous bombardment was designed to destroy the Union artillery and demoralize the infantry defending Cemetery Ridge. For nearly 2 hours, Confederate gunners poured shot and shell into the Union positions, creating a cacophony that could be heard for miles in every direction. Contemporary accounts preserved in the Library of Congress collection, including letters from soldiers on both sides, describe the artillery duel as the most intense cannonade witnessed during the entire war. However, the bombardment failed to achieve its intended effect. Many Confederate shells overshot their targets, landing harmlessly behind the Union lines. Union Artillery Chief Brigadier General Henry Jackson Hunt had ordered his gunners to conserve ammunition by temporarily ceasing fire, creating the illusion that the Confederate barrage had been successful. When the infantry assault began, Union cannoneers would have ample ammunition to greet the advancing Confederates with devastating fire. At approximately 3:15 that afternoon, nearly 15,000 Confederate soldiers emerged from the woods along Seminary Ridge and began their march across the mile of open ground toward Cemetery Ridge. Led by divisions under Generals George Edward Pickett, James Johnson Pettigrew, and Isaac Ridgway Trimble, this massive column represented the flower of Lee's army. The sight of these veteran troops advancing in perfect formation created a mixture of admiration and dread among Union observers. As the Confederate assault force reached the midpoint of their advance, Union artillery opened fire with crushing effect. Cannonballs tore through the advancing ranks, creating bloody gaps that were quickly filled by soldiers stepping forward from the rear. The men pressed on with remarkable courage, their battle flags snapping in the summer breeze as they approached the stone wall that marked the Union front line. The climactic moment came when a portion of the Confederate assault actually breached the Union line near a copse of trees that had served as the attackers' aiming point. Brigadier General Lewis Addison Armistead, waving his hat on the tip of his sword, led several hundred Virginians over the stone wall in what would be known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. For a brief moment, Confederate victory seemed possible as hand-to-hand combat raged among the Union guns. But the breakthrough was short-lived. Union reinforcements rushed to seal the gap, and Armistead fell mortally wounded near the captured artillery pieces. The Confederate assault, having traveled so far with such gallant determination, finally broke apart under the concentrated fire of Union infantry and artillery. The survivors began the long, painful retreat back across the blood-soaked field, carrying their wounded comrades and the bitter taste of defeat. The aftermath of Pickett's charge marked a profound transformation in the character and momentum of the American Civil War. As Confederate survivors straggled back across the corpse-strewn field toward Seminary Ridge, General Lee rode out to meet them, his face etched with the grief of a commander who had asked too much of his brave soldiers. "It is all my fault," he told the returning troops, taking personal responsibility for the disaster that had befallen his army. The casualties from the 3-day battle were staggering. The Army of Northern Virginia had lost approximately 28,000 men, representing more than a third of Lee's effective strength. Among the Confederate dead were numerous irreplaceable officers, including Brigadier Generals Lewis Armistead, Richard Brooke Garnett, and James Johnston Pettigrew. These veterans of countless battles could not be easily replaced, and their loss would be felt in every subsequent engagement. Union casualties, while also severe at approximately 23,000, represented a smaller percentage of Meade's total force and could be more readily replaced from the North's larger population. More importantly, the Army of the Potomac had demonstrated that it could stand toe-to-toe with Lee's vaunted veterans and emerge victorious. The psychological impact of this achievement cannot be overstated, as it marked the first time a Union Army had decisively defeated Lee in a major engagement. For General Lee, the defeat at Gettysburg represented more than just a tactical setback. It shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded his army since the 7 Days Battles of Carey, 1862. The strategic objectives of the Pennsylvania campaign lay in ruins. Instead of forcing Lincoln to negotiate peace, the invasion had strengthened Northern resolve and provided the Union with a desperately needed victory at a crucial moment in the war. The retreat of the Army of Northern Virginia began on the night of July 4th, Independence Day, adding symbolic weight to the Confederate defeat. Lee's wagon train of wounded stretched for 17 miles as the army limped back toward Virginia through torrential rains that turned roads into quagmires. Union cavalry harassed the retreating columns, but Meade, perhaps overly cautious after his hard-won victory, failed to pursue aggressively enough to destroy Lee's battered force. According to military historians, and documented in numerous scholarly works including those in the Gettysburg National Military Parks archives, Lee's successful retreat despite his weakened condition demonstrated his tactical brilliance even in defeat. President Lincoln, monitoring events from Washington, was initially elated by news of the victory, but became frustrated when he learned that Lee's army had escaped back to Virginia largely intact. "We had them within our grasp," Lincoln lamented. "We had only to stretch forth our hands, and they were ours." The president understood that destroying Lee's army might have ended the war months or even years earlier than it ultimately concluded. Nevertheless, the strategic implications of Gettysburg extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The defeat permanently ended Confederate hopes for foreign intervention, particularly from Great Britain and France, who had been carefully watching American developments while considering recognition of Southern independence. European powers, impressed by Northern industrial capacity and now convinced of Union military competence, would maintain their neutrality for the remainder of the conflict. In the Western theater, the timing of Gettysburg proved equally significant. On July 4th, the same day Lee began his retreat from Pennsylvania, General Ulysses Simpson Grant accepted the surrender of the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg, Mississippi. This twin victory split the Confederacy geographically and gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, fulfilling a key component of the Anaconda Plan to strangle the South economically. The combined impact of these July victories marked a fundamental shift in the war's trajectory. The Confederacy, which had previously fought from a position of strategic optimism, now found itself permanently on the defensive. Confederate morale, both military and civilian, began a slow but irreversible decline as the reality of their deteriorating situation became increasingly apparent. The South would fight on for nearly 2 more years, but never again would Confederate forces threaten Northern territory or seriously challenge Union strategic control. The transformation was perhaps most evident in the political sphere. Northern Democrats who had advocated for a negotiated settlement found their peace platform undermined by military success. Lincoln's Republican administration, previously under intense criticism for the war's conduct, now basked in public approval that would carry the president to re-election in 1864. The months following Gettysburg witnessed a cascading series of Confederate setbacks that transformed the strategic landscape of the war. The Army of Northern Virginia, once the South's most potent weapon, had been fundamentally weakened by the Pennsylvania campaign. Lee's losses in experienced officers and veteran non-commissioned officers proved particularly devastating, as these seasoned leaders had been the backbone of Confederate tactical superiority throughout the early years of the conflict. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, recognizing the gravity of the situation, attempted to bolster Lee's forces by transferring troops from other theaters. However, this strategy merely created weaknesses elsewhere without significantly strengthening the primary army. The Confederacy's limited industrial base and shrinking population meant that losses sustained at Gettysburg could never be fully replaced with soldiers of equivalent quality and experience. The psychological impact of Gettysburg reverberated throughout the Confederate States. For 2 years, Southern civilians had sustained themselves with the belief that their armies were invincible, and that independence was simply a matter of time. The news that Lee's mighty host had been repulsed at Gettysburg shattered these illusions and marked the beginning of a slow erosion of Confederate morale that would accelerate as the war progressed. Union commanders, emboldened by their success at Gettysburg, began to press their advantages more aggressively across all theaters of operation. General William Tecumseh Sherman's Atlanta campaign in 1864 demonstrated the Union's growing strategic sophistication as federal forces systematically dismantled Confederate infrastructure while advancing deeper into the Southern heartland. The capture of Atlanta, just before the presidential election, provided Lincoln with the political capital necessary to secure re-election and continue the war to its ultimate conclusion. The economic consequences of Gettysburg proved equally damaging to Confederate prospects. European investors, who had previously shown interest in Confederate bonds and trade relationships, now viewed the Southern cause as increasingly hopeless. The flow of foreign capital and supplies that had helped sustain the Confederate war effort dwindled to a trickle, further constraining Southern military capabilities. Research compiled from Federal Reserve economic history data and Civil War financial records housed at the Virginia Historical Society demonstrates how the economic impact of Gettysburg extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. Lee himself seemed to recognize that Gettysburg had fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. In his correspondence with Richmond, the Confederate commander adopted an increasingly defensive tone, focusing on preserving his army rather than seeking decisive victory. This change in strategic approach reflected the harsh reality that the Confederacy could no longer afford the losses associated with offensive operations against increasingly well-equipped and confident Union forces. The battles that followed. Gettysburg bore little resemblance to the war's earlier engagements. At the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor in 1864, Lee demonstrated his continued tactical brilliance by inflicting severe casualties on Grant's advancing armies. However, these victories proved Pyrrhic, as the Union could replace its losses while the Confederacy could not. Grant's strategy of continuous pressure gradually wore down Confederate resistance through a process of strategic attrition. The leadership vacuum created by Gettysburg's casualties became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. Younger Confederate officers thrust into positions of responsibility before gaining adequate experience lacked the tactical acumen of their predecessors. This deficit became particularly noticeable during the complex maneuvers required for defensive warfare, as Confederate units increasingly struggled to coordinate their movements effectively. Confederate logistics, always a weak point, deteriorated rapidly after Gettysburg. The loss of so much equipment during the Pennsylvania campaign strained an already overburdened supply system. Southern railroads, lacking adequate maintenance and facing constant Union raids, could no longer reliably transport supplies to front-line units. Soldiers began to desert in increasing numbers, driven by hunger, inadequate equipment, and news of hardships faced by their families at home. By early 1865, the Confederate position had become untenable. Lee's army, now reduced to fewer than 30,000 effective soldiers, found itself surrounded at Petersburg by Grant's overwhelming forces. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia, which had marched into Pennsylvania with such confidence just 2 years earlier, was now a shadow of its former self, sustained only by the indomitable will of its commander and the fading hope that foreign intervention might yet save the Confederate cause. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, represented the inevitable conclusion of a process that had begun on the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg nearly 2 years earlier. When General Lee rode out to meet General Grant in Wilmer McLean's parlor, he carried with him not just the surrender of his army, but the acknowledgement that the Confederate dream of independence had been irrevocably shattered by the events of July 1863 in Pennsylvania. The scene at Appomattox embodied both the tragedy and the nobility of the Confederate cause. Lee, immaculately dressed despite his army's dire circumstances, maintained his dignity even in defeat. Grant, mindful of his opponent's stature and the need for national reconciliation, offered generous terms that allowed Confederate officers to keep their sidearms and soldiers to retain their horses for spring plowing. This magnanimity in victory reflected the Union's confidence that the war had been definitively won. The statistics of Confederate collapse painted a stark picture of how completely Gettysburg had altered the war's trajectory. Lee's army, which outnumbered approximately 75,000 men at the beginning of the Pennsylvania campaign, surrendered fewer than 28,000 soldiers at Appomattox. Many units that had fought with distinction at Gettysburg simply no longer existed, their battle flags furled forever in the humid Virginia countryside. The broader implications of Gettysburg's impact on Confederate defeat extended beyond mere military considerations. The battle had demonstrated to the world that the United States possessed both the industrial capacity and military competence necessary to preserve the Union. This demonstration proved crucial in maintaining foreign neutrality and ensuring that the Confederacy would face the full might of the North without European assistance. President Lincoln, in his Gettysburg Address delivered at the dedication of the battlefield cemetery in November 1863, had transformed the Union, caused from mere preservation of the federal system, into a moral crusade for democracy and human freedom. This rhetorical transformation, made possible by the victory on Pennsylvania soil, provided the ideological framework that would sustain Northern will through the war's bloody final phases. Historical analysis preserved in the Abraham Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress reveals how the Gettysburg Address fundamentally reframed the war's meaning and purpose, creating a narrative that would endure long after the last shots were fired. The economic transformation of the United States during and after the war owed much to the confidence generated by Gettysburg. Northern industry, mobilized for war production, emerged from the conflict as the most powerful manufacturing base in the world. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, symbolized the energy and ambition that Gettysburg had helped unleash in American society. For the defeated South, Gettysburg marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the region for generations. The plantation system, already weakened by wartime disruptions, could not survive the loss of slave labor and the devastation of Confederate defeat. Reconstruction, however flawed in its implementation, would eventually create opportunities for African Americans to participate in American democracy in ways that would have been inconceivable before the war. The veterans of Gettysburg, both Union and Confederate, would carry the memory of those 3 days for the rest of their lives. Their reunions in later years, marked by reconciliation rather than recrimination, demonstrated that the healing Lincoln had called for in his second inaugural address had indeed taken place. Former enemies shook hands across the stone wall on Cemetery Ridge, their advanced age softening the sharp edges of old animosities. Military historians continued to debate the precise reasons for Confederate defeat, but few question that Gettysburg represented the turning point from which Southern recovery proved impossible. The combination of tactical defeat, strategic exposure, and psychological deflation created a wound in the Confederate cause that never healed. Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, conceived as the masterstroke that would secure Southern independence, instead became the vehicle for Confederate destruction. The legacy of Gettysburg extends far beyond its immediate military consequences. The battle demonstrated that democratic institutions could survive even the most severe internal challenges. The Union's victory affirmed the principle that governments deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed could not be dissolved by the unilateral action of a dissatisfied minority. As the last Confederate battle flags were furled, and the Army of Northern Virginia passed into history, the significance of those 3 days in July 1863 became clear. Gettysburg had not merely been a Union victory. It had been the moment when the American experiment in self-government proved that it possessed the strength and resilience to endure. The high watermark of the Confederacy reached for that brief moment when Armistead's men breached the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, would stand forever as the point beyond which the cause of Southern independence could not advance. The streets of Gettysburg, which had echoed with the sounds of battle in 1863, would eventually return to peaceful commerce. But the town would never escape its place in American memory as the location where the tide of war turned decisively, marking the beginning of the end for the Confederate States of America and the preservation of the Union that Lincoln had sworn to defend.